Well, they told me to ask you. No, you guys go all the time.
Go all the time where?
To the holiday gala.
Holiday gala? This is the high holy days that we're talking about.
Janice.
Holiday gala? I don't know what the holiday gala is.
Every year in December.
Yeah.
Our school.
Oh, yes, then I think more baskets. Yes,
A party?
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, now where should I bring them all?
We can have baskets next time.
Okay.
In October is fine, because I won't do the baskets till November. Okay.
We're just saving it for you.
So you just do like a few minutes of this and
Are you gonna join the palms?
Why is that? Why was that
I think
in
it's the last year.
In January.
Good afternoon, everybody. So unfortunately, today is our last class. We're making up for 2 classes, so it'll go from 1 to 4, but it probably won't go the entire duration. So I hope you'll stay with us the entire time. A couple of clarifications before I start. A lot of you expressed interest last week and the preceding weeks about the Tongva Nation and the Gabrieleño in LA County. Well, I did some more research on how many members there are, and for some reason I can't get a straight answer, but the most agreeable number I found was about 1,500 members claiming.
I got up to 17.
17, okay. And again, that's a state-recognized tribe, not a federally recognized tribe. And less than a handful even speak a few words of the language, but it is revitalizing. Second clarification, upon consulting the videos of my last lecture, it seems that some of my wording last week might have been a little misleading. In trying to determine whether the California Indian story was genocide, I mentioned that the U.S. Army was never sent in to eradicate or force Native Americans out of regions in California. That's true, but some of you mentioned the Modoc War in Northern California, where indeed the U.S. Army was sent in and did do battle with Native Americans. That's true as well, but it's a very different phenomenon. What happened was the Modoc tribes in Modoc County felt shortchanged by a treaty that was made between the U.S. government and the Klamath Nation. So they rose up, and the U.S. Army was sent in to quell the revolt. But that's very different than going in and eradicating a population or purifying a region. That would be a genocide. It's semantics, but these things really do matter. So, with that said, let's get started. Today we'll have a lecture, and then a movie, and then a break, another lecture, and then another movie. And the first lecture will be about the Native Americans of Canada, the First Nations. Then we'll have a movie about the growing competition between the Native Americans and the U.S. government over resources, like the Iroquois. And then we'll have a very short lecture about the Alaska Natives and the Inuit tribes. And then we'll have a final movie about a couple of episodes of proud Native American resistance to the U.S., particularly the Apache and Geronimo. But the video also discusses the boarding schools, which, as some of us mentioned, might constitute cultural genocide. So this week, since most of the course has been about the Native American experience under American rule, I thought it would be interesting and illuminating to shed light on a very different experience in Canada. And it's a very broad overview, because it's a big country, not a continent. So keep that in mind. But before we start, a couple of stats for your information. There are 630 federally recognized tribes in Canada, which is far more than the United States, which has just over 500. And there's a total of 700,000 First Nations people in Canada, which is very small compared to the 2 to 5 million in the United States. They were called Indians until the 1980s, but more and more the term First Nations is preferred. They're divided into 3 groups for your information. First group is called the Métis, which is mixed descent from usually French settlers, sometimes British, and Native American locals. Second group is the Inuit of the very far north. And the third group is all other tribes connected to the First Nations identity. And they all have very similar rights under national law, but they have different cultural protection measures. And unlike the United States, most Native Americans in Canada do live on reserves, which is the Canadian equivalent of the reservation. Unlike in America, where most Native Americans live in the cities since the 1950s. And there are 2,300 reserves in Canada, which is a lot more than the 300 in the United States. Most of them are very small, but some of them are also quite large. And unlike the United States, there are many cases where Native Americans living on the reserve do pay taxes, for your edification. So, the First Nations experience is very different than the Native American experience in the United States for many reasons. First being most obvious, Canada was a colony until 1931 of sorts. America stopped being a colony in 1776. Second difference is the First Nations lived in a very white, homogeneous colony. They were struggling with and interacting with a very singular, homogeneous society, unlike the United States, where Native Americans were living in a very plural society. There were many more minorities with whom the U.S. government had to make compromises and accommodate. So, First Nations lived in a very homogeneous society, and Native Americans in a very plural society. Third difference is Canada is massive. It's far larger than the United States, of course, but it's incredibly sparse. Unlike many of the very dense conflict zones on the east coast of the United States, where the U.S. government came into conflict with the settled tribes there, the entire population of Canada is several million less than the population of California alone. So, oversimplify it, there was far more room for whites and Native Americans to live in the same country, at least, than there was in the United States. Less proximity means less conflict over resources, which means less violence overall in Canada. Also, they were more spread out, there was less contact, less confinement, so there was less disease. Unlike the United States, which, as we know, most Native Americans die because of disease. It was not the same way in Canada. Another difference is almost the entire settler population in Canada was in the far southeast, in Quebec and Ontario, that area. But Native Americans populated the entire country, all the way to the far north, stretching to Alaska. So the Native Americans in Canada very less often got in the way, unlike in the United States, which was far more dense. It was easy, more or less, for the Canadian government to essentially let Native Americans live on the fringes of the colony and mind their own business. Whereas in the United States, the country was expanding very rapidly to the west. So, the First Nations in Canada did not limit or undermine Canadian progress as much as they got in the way of manifest destiny. Of course, because Canada is so sparse, the whites didn't have to intrude on Native American lands as often, which, as part of this vicious cycle we've been discussing, Native Americans didn't have to fight back, and then white people didn't have to retaliate again. So overall, there was less conflict. Another key difference is that the First Nation tribes are more often nomadic than the tribes on the east coast of the United States, which are mostly sedentary, dealing with agriculture and permanent residences. So obviously the nomadic tribes were less often in Canada's way. So long story short, again, there's less violence towards Native Americans in Canadian history. However, there's a long history of chauvinism and condescension and discrimination in the Canadian context than the United States. In many ways, it's more exclusionary in terms of nationality. So the very different relationship between the First Nations and Canada was obviously the result of Canada's very different history. The Native American experience in Canada was usually defined by the wars between the imperial powers around them, the French and the British, and their respective Native American allies. In the United States, the wars were usually tribe against the government, one-on-one, or many different allies. In Canada, usually the Native Americans were dragged in between these powers, between the wars of imperialists. And the benefit of this was that rather than simply being on the defensive against the United States, the First Nations had a bargaining chip. They could barter between the imperial powers. Do you want us to support you? Will you give us money in exchange? Will you give us protection against the French? So they had an ability to negotiate with the imperialists around them, whereas in America, they were out of luck. Another key difference is most conflict in Canada was over resources, not land, especially over beavers and fur in Acadia and Ontario, and what later became Quebec. An example is the Beaver Wars of the mid-1700s with France and over 21 First Nation allies who fought against the United Kingdom and their Iroquois allies and the Dutch. And because most of the wars were over resources, the more entrepreneurial tribes in Canada, like the Cree, or the Iroquois, who had a monopoly on the fur trade, were able to basically offset British domination. In many ways, the British often needed the Native Americans for trade purposes. So in many cases, there was less violence and more trade, more business, which is a mutually beneficial process. In many cases, Native Americans were somewhat ambivalent towards the British settlers because they had the chance to make a lucrative process. They were less anxious to force the British out. Another important factor is many First Nations tribes wanted protection from the British, the protection of the British against more hostile First Nations tribes. Because as we've mentioned, there were many tribes in the United States that were peaceful, but there were many that were also incredibly belligerent. Most prominent being the Cree, who had a very prolific slave trade, and they also had guns that they got from the fur trade. They would constantly raid Native American villages and capture slaves and extract tribute. So many of the tribes around them were anxious to have the British keep the Cree out and protect their lands. So Native Americans were, for another reason, also very ambivalent towards the British because the British had a unique policy where they did not have to assimilate into British society, and I'll get to that later. So it's for these reasons that almost all First Nations supported the British eventually in the War of 1812 against the United States. But the main turning point in First Nations history is the French and Indian Wars between the British and the French and their respective Native American allies. And after 1763, all of Canada belonged to the British. The French were gone. So Native Americans were left to the devices of the British policy towards Native Americans. And in general, I mean, there were some conflicts over buffalo and resources, and the Métis, the mixed people, often rose up against the Canadian government because they felt, as half white, they were more civilized than the Native Americans, so they deserved more rights than they were given. But in general, the next 200 years was pretty peaceful for the First Nations, largely because of Canada's huge space, but also the British native policy, which was very different than the United States. In the United States, as we've been discussing, the government vacillated between, do we forcibly assimilate these Native Americans, or do we empower them as their own separate sovereign nations? In general, as we've discussed, the U.S. government recognized the tribes as sovereign, independent nations until they got in the way. And when they made treaties with these reservations, they usually gave them welfare or some kind of indemnity thereafter, sometimes in perpetuity. In Canada, it was very different. The British and the Canadians gave the Native Americans two options. You either stay on the reservation with your own culture with no benefits of Western white society, meaning no welfare usually, no indemnity in return, or you completely abandon your entire Indian heritage and you assimilate into British society. So the British openly gave them the option to become Canadian and British citizens, but only if they abandoned all Aboriginal title and all claims of nationality. And so this is the option to what they call enfranchise. They could become citizens voluntarily, but at a cost, of course, of their own heritage. And to this end, after the 1870s, the Canadians set up the similar boarding schools that you saw in the United States. But this was a chance not to forcibly assimilate people, but to facilitate the process of voluntary enfranchisement. So instead of being taken from your family, we would help you become a citizen. Of course, several thousand children were taken from their parents without permission whatsoever. But it was still somewhat different than the United States. So this mutually exclusive nationality policy in Canada is the main difference that sets the First Nation experience apart. So what you had was a dichotomy, really. The First Nations living on the reservation, their cultures flourished. They kept their languages, and most of them survived to this day. But for those who assimilated, their culture was eradicated. And skipping ahead, the next major thing is that, as in the United States, many First Nations people volunteered to serve in the British and Canadian armies in World War I.